Now, you grew up in Gothenburg.
Yes.
Now, this is a port industrial city.
Port town, industrial town, shipyards, you know, maybe you heard about Volvo, car industry,
Started there.
heavy trucks, very industrialized city. And the used to be sort of the connection, it was the way to beat the Danes, because the Danes would control all the trade going into the Baltic Sea, and the only way to get around them was through Gothenburg.
Oh, I see.
So therefore it became a very important port.
And the Norwegians were ruled by Denmark for a long time, weren't they?
Yeah, it was sort of a subsidiary of
So the
Denmark.
Swedes, you've had to take on Norway and Denmark together.
Yeah, Norwegians were never a problem, but the Danes, you know,
Yeah, you gotta watch
Copenhagen
them.
were really tough.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we know what they're like. Yeah. Okay. Now, you know, I was thinking about the book Why Nations Fail at Harvard and MIT, and it was talking about Sweden. Sweden when there was in the late 19th century was actually a very poor place. I studied in Minnesota in America, which was full of Swedish immigration in the 19th century. Was that when Sweden was principally rural?
you could say that, first of all, part of, I think, of turning around Sweden was that about 20% of the population actually went to pretty much Minnesota. Chicago also was a big place. I think after Stockholm, the second largest Swedish city for many, many years was actually Chicago. In the 19th century. So, no, Sweden was, used to be actually a rather rich country, partly like this part of Australia based on copper ore.
Yes.
And from that we built wealth, and through wealth we could build a mighty army and navy and so forth. So Sweden became sort of the Baltic, you know, little empire in the 17th century. But through wars, and I would say what destroys nations typically, and you know, you build up your economies, etc., is of course through war. So we were fighting these wars, and we were totally destroying all that was built up in terms of innovation, technology, and economic wealth. So, as you say, in the early 19th century, Sweden was one of the poorest places in Europe and on Earth, actually. And part of that process, Finland had been a natural part of Sweden since, you know, before the Middle Ages, back to sort of the Viking era. So Russia took their chance to...
As they do.
Yeah, and so they took Finland from us. So we lost Finland in 1809. And it ended actually with a military coup in Stockholm. So they told the king to get out of the castle, get on a horse, and ride somewhere else. And he did, and he went down into Europe somewhere. And they were looking for a new leader to lead the country into back into some sort of prosperity again. And they found one of Napoleon's marshals, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, who was a common man down from the south of France and made his way up with a career in those days because you know the nobility and everything had lost their position after the French Revolution. So just people from normal walks of life could make careers So he was French. He had become one of Napoleon's marshals. So he took on the job. He was given the job of becoming king of Sweden. And still the Swedish royal family is the descendants of their family name is Bernadotte.
You're originally French?
It's a French family that rules Sweden.
Yes, yes.
So he was supposed to be the great leader. Actually, what turned out later was that he didn't become really the great leader. I think his idea was if he could take Sweden as sort of the poor little tiny country up in the north, that could be a way in his career to come back to Paris and take over after Napoleon, his rival. So in order to do this, he actually joined up with a Russian Tsar in the war between Russia and France. So he quickly used the Swedish army to fight his old French army with the Russians and went all the way back to Paris. And the Tsar tried to install him on the throne sort of after Napoleon. But the nobility and the leadership of France said, no, we don't really trust this guy. He used to be one of our marshals and generals. He went to Sweden and he turned the soldiers of Sweden onto us. So he was sent back to Stockholm, and he was a very depressed king, actually. And we still talk about running your government in the bedchamber, because actually he would have all the ministers come around the bed. He would pretty much never leave the bed.
Is that right?
No, so I think his whole career stopped there. So, but Sweden anyway, without having maybe the great leader, started to shift, and that's back to what you mentioned, Why Nations Fail book, changed the institutions, mandatory schooling, free press, a number of things came sort of mid-19th century that really transformed Sweden.
So it took a crisis.
Open trade, etc. Sorry. Yes.
It took a crisis
Yeah.
to do it.
So, and that was tough changes, but so the institutional change came, let's say, 1840s, 1850s, and then in the late 19th century, you would see companies like Ericsson evolve and Alfa Laval and these that later became the great companies. So we had a big transformation. So, and then we managed to keep out of the wars, First and Second World War, which of course was very important for us, not to have our factories bombed, etc.
You stayed neutral, but,
Stayed neutral,
but you,
yeah.
I mean, many of Europe's Jews were protected by Sweden, weren't they? Many of them got out of Germany and Poland and hid in Sweden.
Yeah, a lot
during the war.
Also from Norway, Denmark.
Was it Wallenberg who got them out of Hungary?
And Wallenberg got them out of Hungary. He became a big hero after that, absolutely.
Yeah. So the Swedes had quite a good record. I mean, the Norwegians put their hand up and surrendered, but the Swedes stayed neutral.
The Danes put their hands up. The Norwegians actually fought a little bit, so there were a little bit of actually war going on. Denmark was more like, we give up there. So, and I think, I don't know, this is maybe going too much into the detail, but I think, and I think some of the records show that the decision from Hitler to invade also Sweden was extremely close. And I have a little hypothesis that actually Hermann Göring, who's one of obviously key people, he was married to a Swede. Had been married to a Swede, had been married into the Swedish nobility after the First World War. So it is possible actually that in the central headquarters, when they were talking about should we invade next month, maybe he would say, we wait with that, we can probably get the iron ore anyway, coming out of the north of Sweden somehow. Yeah,
so they left him alone.
So they decided not to, so that was very lucky for Sweden. But it was very close. All the plans were there, how to go in with the armies and navies.
And the Swedes were so small, they wouldn't have lasted long, would they? They had to fight.
No. After the First World War, we pretty much, in the 1920s, we closed down the whole military, basically, so there was not much there.
Well, the Great Depression was very important in Australia and here in South Australia in the sense that when the Great Depression hit, the Premier's plan, the governments of the day, they cut the budget, they cut the basic wage by 10% in 1931. They had the exchange rate on the gold standard, and they basically put up tariffs. They did everything wrong. And yet when Australia faced the global financial crisis, we had a fiscal stimulus, we made sure that interest rates were low, we ensured that wages grew, and we had a floating exchange rate, we kept tariffs low. We did almost the exact opposite of the 30s, and in many ways the 1930s shaped Australia's response to the most recent global slump. What experience did Sweden have in the 30s?
I think Sweden, first of all, the whole world was affected by the shocks, and we had, I don't know if you remember the old matchboxes, Swedish match.
Yes.
But it's almost built up a monopoly in the 19th century of matches around the world.
Yes.
And the guy who created this, his name was Ivar Kreuger, and he became, some of you who read history interested in this, remember his name, and he, developed an enormous sort of kind of banking operation, lending money to governments, etc., and building up companies all around the world based on the wealth that he created from matchmaking. So I guess now, this is 1932, this whole thing collapsed for him, and he shot himself in Paris.
Oh, did
and all of sort of his empire kind of collapsed, and I think about between 10 or 20% of all savings in Sweden of ordinary people disappeared.
Well, that a huge financial collapse.
Yeah. So it was a big shock also to Sweden. But I think, again, given that our industries were in good shape after the First World War and all that, so I think Sweden continued. But of course, and everyone had problems, and then into the Second World War. But particularly after the World War, Europe was destroyed. In Sweden, we have the steel industries and the mining and all that. So all those companies and all those industries, they just had to decide which customer would be delivered to. I mean, the whole of Europe were asking for.
Were you already an open economy in the 30s? you already
Yeah. And then actually that change happened as part of this, as I say, the institutional shift in the 19th century. And there was a big fight, as in every country, should we protect ourselves or should we open up? And the free traders sort of won, and they did a couple of things. They opened up for free trade, and they also said we should allow for foreign investment to come in, particularly British money, to build our railways and our industries. So a lot of the boost to Sweden, as I said, was a very poor country, came from foreign money, foreign investment, and from, like today's Chinese investment, right?
Yes.
Like Volvo is today, Volvo Car is a Chinese company, and Saab.
Saab has got Chinese money.
That was closed down. The government did not bail out Saab. Now they're, a Chinese company setting up electric, using the factory for electrical cars and so forth. So, but in those days, it was about British money, British investments, British technology to build up the infrastructure of Sweden. So free trade was part of this also.
Part of from the start. Yeah. I mean, because as you know, in Australia, we had in Federation a pact that said if we had a free trade, a protection, and a Labor Party, and the Labor Party originally in New South Wales had an alliance with the Free Traders, and in Victoria they had an alliance with the Protectionists. Okay. And so when we became a federation, the Protectionists, Alfred Deakin said, well, if you give us protection, we'll give you an arbitration court, which of course had originally come from South Australia. Yeah. And so we ended up being protectionist by convenience. And then it wasn't until 1983 when the 80s, modern Labor government opened up
which made a huge impact onto Australia, right? In this opening up, becoming part of the global economy, rather than a protected economy where you would do everything here. Cars.
Well, what's interesting, because I mean, when I was sitting in this hall 30 years ago, Australia had one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, in the OECD, one of the highest inflation rates. We won the Olympic gold medal for strikes. Okay. And
I didn't know those Olympic.
Well, we won it every year. And of course, we didn't have as many foreign students or foreign tourists as we have now. And yet you sit here 30 years ago, 30 years later, we're down under the down under, the doyen of the OECD. We got through the global financial crisis without a scratch, but as an open economy, but as an economy that still has an arbitration system with the Fair Work Commission. It still has Medicare and education. So in many ways, as we've been open, policymakers have said, well, we'll have an open economy, but you've still got to have labour market institutions to ensure that people who get hurt can get retraining and
the Swedish
find a
model,
job.
right?
Well, that's the Swedish model, isn't it?
It's not the Anglo-Saxon model, at least. That's it's quite different, I think.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because I was interested in when we in Australia in the press talk about the car industry. Very important here to South Australia. Most of the free market economists will say, stop propping up the car industry, stop propping up manufacturing, don't use taxpayers' money. While in Sweden, you have an interest in innovation and industry policy. It's a little bit more eclectic, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's not. I mean, economists sometimes try to make the world black or white. It's either policy or it's not policy, and that's why I think I spoke briefly about this also yesterday in the session, that there is this whole gray zone between heavy hand deciding this is the way we do it, or we own the car industry, or we run the car industry, to saying we don't do anything. And if you look, that's why using even in countries like United States, where they think of most things being sort of natural and sort of the invisible hand in terms of markets is sort of running the show. I use Silicon Valley as an example when I talk about the construction of Silicon Valley. It's not just that it happened, it actually happened that there were decisions made by different actors on that cluster stage saying, for example, one of the important ones, Stanford, saying, we will open up the doors for industry, we will allow for industry to co-locate so we can get some interesting things going on between research and our students and industry. And at the same time, as most other universities would say, we don't want to touch, be in contact with industry and so forth. So, and then there were, defense contracts and a number of things that has to do with policy, Californian policy, it's federal policy, that plays a role. So it's not black and white like that. And I think, as you say, also in Sweden, it's, we have a number of policies that relates to innovation, relates to clusters or getting sort of the, Sweden to play a role in the world economies in various ways. And I think that's even in countries like the United States, it's not black or white like that. But again, there was a big pressure on the Swedish government when Saab had problems. Some would say, maybe they should bail them out. The government should own Saab. They should, be producing cars. But the government said, no, we don't want to be running a car industry. We can certainly include policies for labor adjustment. They started some policies around innovation, around new engine technologies. I mean, there can be a lot of things done, which is not just to go in, give the company, 100 million or, take over ownership. So there are many ways of, I think, involving government in policy, which is not, just give GM $1 billion or something,
to go back to 1956 when you and Bjorn Borg were born. You've taken us through the 19th century and the opening up of the institutions in Sweden. You did very well out of the war because Europe was ruined. In 1956, 7 years after the war, this is when Australia signed their first trade agreement with Japan, for instance, to get into Asia. What did Sweden do then in the 50s and 60s? Was that the beginning of the Swedish model?
I think we were abusing the Swedish model, at least into the 1970s. The problem was that, it's always, Sweden then did very well, as you say, and, every year or every decade, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, you would see the economy rise. And the politician would say, this is fantastic. It's probably us, running this country. And if they didn't have enough money to run their policies, they would just increase taxes. So nothing really happened. They increased maybe average tax out of GDP from, let's say, 40% to 45. They got more money, 45 to 50, 50. So they just increased taxes. And this went totally, I would say, astray. And it's not until somewhere into the 70s and the 1980s that they realized, and you could just look at the scoreboards. We used to be one of the richest countries, like GDP per capita, these kind of measures. And I think if you take around 1980, I would guess maybe we were down to place maybe number 15 or 17 or something like that. So you could even see these things. But the politicians, and this would be mostly the Social Democrats in those days, say, no, that's not a problem. We are a very strong country. We have a good economy, and we can introduce pretty much any policy, to build up our social welfare, etc. So that came to a halt. And I think exactly the time when the Australian politicians, Bob Hawke, came to Sweden was the time when we realized we have big problems. But probably they showed,
they got a good
show probably when they came to Sweden, how you could do everything with policy, which was of course not true. So we also went through a lot of institutional change. The debate about maybe becoming part of Europe started. Maybe we should open up our financial markets, etc. So a lot of things happened in those days. It took a little while, and then into the 1990s we were back on track again. And I would say today we are a very, very strong economy. And I don't know if you read The Economist, but early this year in February there was a big Viking with the horns, on the front page, talking about the Nordic model and Sweden being the most competitive country in the world and all these things, talking about changes in our tax systems, changes in our legislation, opening up for privatization, etc. A number of things that is part of Sweden today. So it's a big change also in Sweden because it went astray, I would say, totally.
I guess you're glad you stayed out of Europe. I mean, there's a new movie coming out called My Big Fat Greek Debt about the issues there. Sweden's had this interesting relationship with Europe, hasn't it? I mean, it trades with Europe, but it's never got involved in the institutions.
No, and I think, first of all, remember, Sweden and France are the two countries in Europe where there's really the nation state and the capital that decides everything. It's a very strong nation state. It's not a federal structure. It's really, it's one CEO that runs the country. I think like Paris and Stockholm are the two. Many European countries are not really countries, it's regions. Okay. If you
Germany and Italy, for example.
Spain, I mean, if you go to the Basque country, they talk about themselves as a country. It's not, we're not Spain. And even if you read the press, these forces in Italy, Spain, other places, Belgium, are extremely strong today. And given that we have the European Union, there is a potential for regions to be world players, at the same time as they can stay quite small. So the interest in the nation state is not as strong anymore, I would say, in many European countries. Also Germany. But Sweden and France, I think, are the nation states run by the capital, so to say.
Well, there's an irony with globalisation, isn't it? That as people have said, we've become more globalised and internationalised with international institutions. A lot of nation states have actually seen very strong regional nationalist movements in Scotland and Wales and the Basque Country and parts of Italy with the Northern League and so on.
Yeah.
That's almost inevitable, isn't it, if people feel globalisation's not delivering for them?
Yeah, I mean, you could take the small Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. You can see that you don't have to be part of a big Soviet Union or to be part. So you can be a small player in the global market as long as you have open trade and so forth. So I think a lot of these regions, if they have a strong history of being a region, like Scotland, can easily see themselves as being a world player or part of the European Union, and they don't have to be part of Great Britain. So this does not happen in countries like Sweden, where there's a very strong central power. But actually, you were asking something else. I forgot. I was maybe.
I was very interested in I was reading some of your work, and I was noticing that Sweden was very strong as an open economy to trade and investment, and as you've opened up your economy, you've made sure you've got very strong social institutions and provided social insurance. What I'm interested now is, in Australia, we've been quite successful as an open trading nation, but immigration, asylum seekers, the boats coming in from Indonesia has been dominating the political agenda here, and we've always been this, isolated island on the bottom of the world. How's immigration handled in Sweden?
If you take that article, that's the way we talked about the article in The Economist. If you take, there's a lot about positive things going on in Sweden. The negative side is immigration in terms of, we also have, burning cars and issues in the suburbs of Stockholm and Malmö, etc. Sweden took on a huge wave of immigration in the last, couple of decades. Particularly refugees from various parts of the world, including Middle East and Africa and so forth. And it's not that easy to get this to work. But I think part of the Swedish miracle is actually this immigration. We get a lot of new people. They have a lot of energy. They bring you, ideas to Sweden and so forth. So I think, yes, it creates a very strong economic and social force, also making Sweden more diverse. It's a more fun place to be actually today than it used to be. More ethnic, more restaurants. It has changed a lot, and I think. But on the other hand, you have the problems of people who have very low levels of education. They come out of areas where there is war. They are not been to school. The kids. They don't speak foreign languages and things like that. So it is quite difficult, and we're tackling that. But and there's no simple answer to how to handle that. But I think overall it has given an enormous energy input to Sweden to open it up, make it more diverse, more fun. If you come to Stockholm, it's a more fun place than it was a couple of decades ago.
It's a barrel of laughs, Stockholm, isn't it?
Sorry?
It's a barrel of laughs, Stockholm.
Yeah.
Are they encouraged to learn English or learn Swedish?
Of course, they have to learn Swedish to go to school, but they are all offered what we call home language. They can always get training with their home language to keep the two languages. And then you take English from when you're 7, I guess.
Because every Swede speaks English beautifully, don't they? I mean, it's quite an advantage.
Except for Björn Borg.
He let his racket do the talking, didn't he? Yeah, that's right. I was interested, going to your special research, the clusters, and your sort of, your work with Michael Porter at Harvard. I mean, I find, I've read your orange book and your green book and everything. It's a fascinating detail of research. I mean, how does it emerge? Do people just say, let's get everyone together and work together? And hold hands? I mean, what's the intellectual framework behind clusters and innovation?
Yeah.
It's almost too good to be true, isn't it, a lot of it?
I think it's not holding hands. I think actually trust is very important in building societies. If you have societies where there's no trust, if there's no institution building where you you trust the government, you trust other people. If you think everyone is going to kill you, if I'm expecting to stab your back all the time, you will never save anything. You will not plan for the future.
I'm not in the Labour caucus, so it won't happen. Don't worry. Yeah.
So you need trust in society. I think that's very, very important. And talking about clusters and innovation and all that, it's partly about people having faith in the future and investing in the future. Otherwise, why innovate? You just try to, entrepreneurship in the worst of places is about just using imperfections like a Soviet economy. No one would be an innovator. No one would be building something for the future, because if you built something that was worth anything, someone would take it from you. So why do anything?
Well, it's interesting with trust, isn't it? Because one of my supervisors here, Ian McLean at Adelaide University, wrote a book, Why Australia Prospered, and in part of that book is comparing Australia and Argentina. So in the 19th century, Argentina and Australia were both had natural resources, they had immigration, that had European settlement, and Buenos Aires was richer than Melbourne 100 years ago at the height of the gold rush. And yet, Australia's built very good institutions, partly thanks to the British. Argentina's really struggled with its courts, with its parliaments, with its political system, with its institutions. And one reason people say is trust, because if you can remember Maradona at the '86 World Cup, he scored the hand of God with his fist. In the same game, he took the ball from the back line and went past 9 English defenders. And they said, what was your proudest moment of your life? And he said, well, the hand of God, when he cheated. And I would have thought, well, wouldn't you be proud of skill? not bending the rules. And if that's in your banking system, if that's in your financial system, that's in your political system, it doesn't matter how many natural resources you have, the nation's going to fail, I would have thought.
Yeah, I did bring the book. It's not my book.
Oh yes, you can plug that one.
It's Harvard, James Robinson and Daron Acemoglu. Why Nations Fail. I recommend this book actually if you haven't bought it. It's exactly about this, And you can take, they have interesting stories in the world. Like you take Germany, you divide it by east and west. You take Korea, and you divide it north to south, etc. And in many of these cases, actually, the poor part, or in the Americas, back in the days when the Spaniards came and the British later came, the rich part was in the south and the poor part was in the north. North Korea, South Korea, same thing. I mean, all the richness, all the natural resources are in the north and not in the south and so forth. So then you put a dividing line, and then some decades later, because of these differences in institutions that can be extractive or more, inclusive, you get enormous differences, like Australia versus Argentina.
Well, it was interesting also that, they even did regions, Mexico, the state of Mexico that's very close to Texas. Yeah. And then they compared the rent-seeking activities of the politicians in Mexico relative to Texas. Yeah. And then Congo and Botswana, similar natural resources, but Botswana's got very good institutions. Yeah. And again, Argentina and Australia. Yeah. There's one thing in the book that intrigued me, and one was some people say that if you live in a tropical place, productivity's low and institutions aren't very good, and they always use the examples of Central America and parts of Africa and the north of Australia. And countries like Sweden, because they're cold, things work, because everyone's working all the time because they've got to be inside. And it's like in the US, Minnesota does well because all the Swedes are there, but Florida, they're struggling. Climate can't explain it, can it?
No, I think they try, at least in this book, to show that these things of geography and climate and things, they don't really work. And as I said, for example, some of the areas that are the hotter areas in the Americas were the rich ones that developed all the institutions. If you go back before the Spanish came and introduced their institutions to the system in the 15th and 16th centuries. So before that, you had the richness was where people were supposed to be lazy, but they were not. So I think, no, it's not about, And it's not about having natural resources. It's not about where you are in terms of if it's cold or warm, etc. It's about how you build those institutions. And if there is a small elite taking all the money from the rest, you're never going to get real wealth going. You have to have a rather inclusive society, a meritocracy where everyone has a chance. Otherwise, it's going to become a North Korea or a Soviet Union or whatever, or an Argentina actually, or Mexico. And,
So
and the Mexican example, on one side of the border you have once upon a time you made the split, and the people on the north of that little border makes 5 times as much money, they are 5 times as healthier than the people south of that border, and they can see each other over the fence.
Like East
there's
Germany
even
and West
pictures
Germany.
in there. So, yeah.
Well, perhaps we'll send that book to Gina Reinhardt in Perth, and she can have a look at it. And finally, I mean, in Australia we have a big debate about geography and the tyranny of distance. And as you say, when we were off watching Sweden in the 80s, and then we opened up our economy and made trade more free, but built up our institutions, Asia became so important.
Yeah.
So it's almost like the lucky country found itself in the right place at the right time, but it had to build the institutions to take advantage of that. Do you think this power proximity is better now than the tyranny of distance that Australia used to worry about?
First, I think the tyranny of distance is partly disappearing. If we, and in many markets, we are developing global markets, markets for information, technology, capital, and many products. And if markets are truly global, and if you take, I don't know what you call that, like a globe you have on your desk at home.
I do, yes.
Yeah, and you put a pin on that. If you put it in Stockholm, or you have a lot of, in your book, Sydney, Singapore, Shanghai, Seoul, St. Petersburg, Seattle. It doesn't matter where you put that pin. It cannot be more or less central if the market is global. So location in that sense does not matter. You can even be in a small part of the world where you used to grow fruit and vegetables like California, and you can be the IT center of the world. So it's not the location of that map, I think, even though in certain instances, take for example attraction of students and mobility of people, maybe this proximity matters. So I realized a lot of Asian students come, for example, to this city and so forth, and that's and maybe you get more here than we get in Europe because of distance. On average. Yeah. So, but when it comes to markets, competing in markets, I think, and many people use the same argument in Sweden. We are in the periphery, it's very difficult, we're not in Central Europe. But if the markets are in China or United States, it doesn't matter if you're in Brussels or Stockholm, it's, as central or decentral.
Well, in the 19th century, we sold wool all over the world. It didn't matter, we didn't have jet planes or anything, but we managed to do it, so it can be done. Now finally, you're an expert on industry policy and clusters and innovation. I have to help the Premier of South Australia design his international strategy around China and India and Southeast Asia. And I've also got to advise him about how you sell South Australia to the world, and what you decide about the car industry or the defence industry or advanced manufacturing. If you were going to give a little package to the Premier, what would you do? And I'll pass it on and give you 10%.
How much do you pay?
20% for Swedes.
I take 1% of the GDP growth of South Australia. Yes, no. First of all, I think we talk about competitiveness of firms and nations. I think another concept which is as important, particularly for a region or a nation, is attractiveness rather than competitiveness. It's about being attractive both to bring companies, foreign companies, investments, to bring students, resources to the area, and to retain them, of course, to be an attractive place. So it's not one big lever. You can do this thing and you will get innovation or you get economic growth. It's about many, many small levers, many small institutions, laws, and changing norms and mental models of people, etc. So I think, first of all, I would be trying actually to be more open. I heard a story of someone who got a very good degree here yesterday, coming from another country, and I think it was some bioscience, and she could not stay in the country because she had to go back to her country. She wouldn't get a work permit, etc. In Sweden now we said the following: if someone can show that they get a job contract with an employer, they get automatically a visa to stay. So if you can get a job, you get a visa to stay. And you can get so much more energy into your economy by bringing more people here. And I mean, Adelaide, it looks as if there is still room to build more around the city here.
Space out there.
Bringing in more people, talent, energy, not just bring them here as students and then throw them back out, I think is stupid. Keep them here, tell them that this is the best place on earth to be, Adelaide or South Australia. So increase attractiveness, I think, on people, foreign companies, capital, ideas, venture capital, whatever it is. And that's a big agenda to do that. And for people who actually go up here to say, you know, this is the place I want to be, like not like you, move to Sydney, you should be here in Adelaide, right?
Oh, I come here a lot. Yes. It's an interesting point actually, because we had an issue where the advertiser said it's a brain drain, everyone's leaving South Australia. But then you go to London and there's, you know, many people from Adelaide, you know, working for the Times and working at Oxford University. There's people in Stanford, there's people in Brazil, there's people in Shanghai. And they all want to make a contribution to Adelaide and to the state. And many of them come back, many of them stay overseas for various reasons or stay in Sydney like me, but they still want to make a contribution. So in many ways, if you have a network of globally connected South Australians who can open doors for companies, you have people here with a global outlook, and then you have immigration, so that when you pull in all these people from all over the world that have studied here and encourage them to stay, perhaps you ultimately have a nice balance between, you know, local grown people that have come here and then people from here that have, you know, played a role in the international network.
It's like a diaspora out there coming back.
Yeah, a bit of brain gain rather than brain drain.
So you get a brain circulation, right? Because also, I mean, you don't want people just to stay here. You want them to go out and come back. I mean, you want some circulation going on. So it's both drain and gain, so to say.
At the same
time. But if you're an attractive place to be in various ways, to bring up a family, to study, to develop corporations, whatever it is, then they'll come back. They have the networks here.
We got some luck because National Geographic was wanting to do a 21st century cities TV program around the world, and National Geographic's got pretty big pull. And they were going to go to Perth or Sydney or Melbourne, and I met them and I said, well, why don't you take a look at Adelaide? And it came out that the National Geographic film producers were in Adelaide during Mad March, when we had the festival, the fringe and everything, and they went, wow, this place is great. So they've made Adelaide the 21st century city, so there you go. So that's worked out well. Good.
See, that's the way to go. That's good.
Well, thanks, Örjan. We're going to open it up to the floor because the attendees here will have fascinated by your work.
I'd like to ask a question. If you would compare your country with Australia, if possible, from a taxation perspective, and focus on perhaps 3 levels of taxation: personal income tax, the GST or value-added tax, and some form of resource tax. And if you would have any advice for the Australian government based on the experience in your country.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
It's a nice, easy question.
We are world experts on taxes in Sweden. We have millions of them. Now, I think personal tax, first of all, we cut them. The general tax level compared to GDP has come down from something like 60+% to 40+% something. So we've cut taxes generally in Sweden. We've cut corporate tax down to 22%. I think that's sort of a competitive level in Europe. Personal tax, we had this, going back to the 1970s again, tax system that became, you know, more and more crazy, that in the end, tax on certain income was over 100%, which creates very odd incentives in an economy. So this was actually particularly on like royalties. And there was one, I don't know if you read Pippi Longstocking here in Australia, but the author Astrid Lindgren then wrote a story about this, that, you know, she was paying roughly 105% tax on the royalties on these books. So we've gone from 105% down to top marginal tax is 58 today, and the government would like to cut this, but, you know, it's difficult to cut taxes because you need the money to spend on social welfare, etc. So I think it will stay at this level for some time. So I think we have rather high personal tax rates on income when it comes to marginal tax rates. VAT is very high in Sweden. It's 25%. Then we have, like other countries start to also adopt, let's say food should not be that much, so we cut on food, and then books should be, 6% or so. But the general tax level for VAT is 25. I don't know the number here in Australia, but it's quite high. So of course we have a big apparatus in Sweden where we actually bring in money to the treasury to send it out in the system again, compared to many other nations. So like in the United States, I think of us as a sort of a communist state because we have so much taxes. But at some level, I think people are prepared to pay taxes in Sweden. We've become used to this, and I think the levels are reasonable. I prefer myself if you could cut the marginal tax a little bit, and there is a debate, maybe anything over 50% is kind of, creates very odd incentives. But no, so taxes are quite high still, I would say, in Sweden. There's and I don't know the Australian levels at all here, but corporate tax rate is 22, marginal tax is 58. Most people pay like 30-35% tax average, because what you pay tax at two levels in Sweden. There is a federal tax, but it's only like 20% of the people that pay federal tax. 80% of people only pay tax to the community, which is usually around 30%. So it's a general tax level.
I don't think the Tea Party likes Sweden very much, does it?
No.
Question?
Thank you. In the description of this session, it talks about talking about the imperative to acquire buy-in from governments to ensure economic success and a creative culture. And you can talk about successful examples, and we can all ignore the unsuccessful and bad ones. How do governments ensure that they're just not taking a gamble and making bets in these areas and wasting taxpayers' money?
This is the pick and winners type scenario.
Yes.
Pick and winners, yeah.
How do they ensure that they are picking winners, and really what we're describing is not governments doing it and talking about the successful examples?
No, I think there is, obviously governments can do good things, they can do bad things. I think we learned some lessons. I think partly why the Swedish government did not buy out Saab, for example, which there was a big pressure on them, was just because we did that in those days, in the 1970s, where we had big structural adjustments in the textile industry and the shipyard industry and the steel industry. And in those days, government would actually go in and buy out, pretty much become an owner of the steel, of the shipyards, of the textiles and so forth. So I think at least that is one of the conclusions. Government should not own businesses, should not run businesses and own companies. We pretty much getting out that. And still the Swedish government is selling off some of their holdings. Only a few weeks ago, because of the bank crisis in the early 1990s, the Swedish government ended up with one of the big banks, so they sold that off a couple of weeks ago, actually. They sold off telecommunications. They pretty much sold off everything except for one of the big energy companies, nuclear energy, water energy, and so forth. So I think that's one area where government have learned a little bit of the lesson, maybe what not to do. But of course, it's difficult just to do good policies all the time. But I think the big difference between the rich and the poor countries in the world is that in the rich countries, typically, there is democracy, and in a democratic system, if things go astray, there will be political forces, there will be elections, and there will be adjustment forces coming up. But in many parts of the world, those adjustments never happen. So the system just goes on. And
doesn't have the checks and balances.
I bought in London, I was visiting professor this spring in London, I bought Zimbabwe dollars. I think it was like $100 trillion. one bill. It's kind of fun to show to people, I have $100 trillion here.
You're a billionaire.
So some systems go totally astray, but I think that's why actually this is interesting, and I guess it's Professor Robinson is also criticized for that, but he says, that's one of the big issues for China, for example, that it has a lot of interesting economic institutions, but when it comes to the political institutions, it is not a democracy, and therefore there are big risks in the whole setup of that political system. Because in this book, at least, they think that why nations fail is because the political institutions are in the end extractive, and certain elites live out of the rest. So
that's a bit depressing, that book. The other one's a bit more optimistic.
Yeah.
Two more questions, yes?
I just recently came back from Greece, where there is a lot of discussion about austerity measures and how they have been imposed on them by the Germans. But I would like to open that question a bit more to the divide in Europe between the countries that feel they're being exploited maybe by the North and the South. Could you mention something about austerity? And this is a solution for Europe. If the South really tightens its belt, will it make them rich?
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Well, I think, first of all, I think the European Union and the whole European project is very, very important as a peace project, which is one particular thing. We don't want another war in Europe. But when it comes to Europe as an economic project, when it comes to monetary policy and fiscal policy and so forth, it is not that easy. Obviously, if you look at the institutions, both the political institutions and the economic institutions, they vary a lot across Europe, across countries, but also within countries sometimes. And when we put this even into a monetary union, and you put in Greece at the same time as Germany, it's like, to exaggerate a little bit, it's like putting in, a developing country and a developed country into the same monetary union. It's not really that easy, and maybe the political power and force of showing a united Europe was so strong that they tended to be a little bit naive about the enormous differences in rule of law and levels of competition and etc. A number of things when it comes to different kinds of both economic and political institutions. And after some time, you realize it's not that easy that they are all in the same monetary union with the euro, lending at the same rates and so forth. And the odd thing is that I think the people in Greece should be really happy that Germany is around, but it turns out the other way. The feeling among the people is that, we don't want to be ruled by the Germans, but I think the only hope for the Greek economy is that actually the German economy is there as the strong economy of Europe. Of course, they could leave. Greece could leave the monetary union. They could leave, some of these institutions, which would mean going back to poverty very, very quickly. You would, the value of the currency. You would cut half everything. Everything, that you. It's valued at some. I mean, if you devalue the currency by, let's say, 50%, everything in Greece becomes half worth. So that would be the result of it. So I think they should be thankful actually that Germany is around protecting the euro, but in the end maybe it will fall apart because these differences are enormous. But again, where I started, we should not forget that the initial force of all these sort of European institution building is actually about a peace project, and I think that project is so important.
This is the final question. Thank you.
About 30 years ago, Australia had one of the most egalitarian distributions of wealth in the world. But like many countries in the last 30 years, that's become a lot less. So now the top 1% own about 10% of our wealth. It's epitomized by the United States, where the top 1% own about 30% of the wealth. And I think that potentially leads to inequality, declining health, can lead to a decline in trust and breakdown institutions. And I believe that that's one of the reasons the United States is breaking down, because there's this complete divide. And I wondered if you'd like to comment on that as it applies to Sweden and applies in general.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there are strong forces. I don't know the numbers for Sweden, but I think, again, I would agree. I have a sense that we are on the same turf there, that if you want a good economic development of a country, you need to spread wealth reasonably among the population. Otherwise, you get these extractive institutions where a few make all their living out of the rest, which is, partly the problem in South America, for example, and many parts of Africa and parts of Asia and so forth. So, yes, some of those tendencies shows that countries like the United States and others is going, in that sense, maybe backwards when it comes to those institutions that Professor Robinson talks about that makes inclusiveness of everyone. And I think, part of this is shown as the CEO compensation and the bonus systems, etc. And I saw some numbers. It used to be like, the average worker level as opposed to the CEO level used to be 1 to 10, 1 to 20, 1 to 40. Now it's 1 to 400, 1 to 500. So yep, these differences are becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and you get a lot of turmoil and problems in society out of that. But I think still countries like in the Nordic countries, etc., have a much more close distribution. But of course, if you take the Soviet model, they try to, or also some African countries, they try to say, we'll collapse this. There's no difference, and that also creates problems. I remember many years back, I lived in Tokyo for a year, and I had a friend at the university. He was from an African country, and I asked him about this, and he said, no, officially, the top levels salaries can only be 4 times, the lowest. So, but of course, we have all the other systems to adjust for that. So I have free house with free car with free. So they created all the systems and institutions to circumvent this official rule of maximum difference, like 4 to 1 or something like that.
Unequal bargaining power.
All the corporations and government and so forth. So, yeah, you need a difference, but the big differences would create, I think, societies that can fail, and I think the US is a big problem in that.
Well, Örjan, thanks very much for your time. We'd love to have you back in Australia, and safe travels back to Sweden, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.